It is January in Norway, 900 AD. In the deep interior of the Scandinavian peninsula, the sun sets at 2 in the afternoon and won't rise again until 10 the next morning. Outside, the temperature hovers at 30 degrees below zero. It is a stillness so cold that the moisture in your breath freezes instantly, coating your beard and eyelashes in ice within minutes. To survive this, a Viking family had to do something that sounds psychologically impossible to us today. They had to lock themselves in a single, windowless room with 30 other people and all their farm animals for 4 months straight. There was no plumbing, no privacy, and very little silence. It was just a central fire, a crowd of bodies, and the dark. Most people picture Vikings living in the grand, great halls seen in movies, massive timber structures with high ceilings and roaring bonfires. But those belonged to the jarls and the kings. For a normal farming family, the reality was the longhouse, a structure that was less of a palace and more of a survival bunker. The design of these houses was strictly functional, dictated by the violence of the winter weather. If you build a tall, flat wall in Scandinavia, the winter gales will eventually catch it like a sail and tear it down. So they built their houses low and curved, the walls bowed outward, making the house look like an overturned boat. This wasn't an aesthetic choice, it was aerodynamics. When a blizzard hit the longhouse, the wind flowed around the curvature of the walls rather than smashing against them. But the structure was only the first line of defense. The real enemy was the thermal bridge. Wood is actually a relatively poor insulator against extreme sub-zero temperatures. If a family relied solely on timber walls, the heat from their fire would bleed out into the night, and they would freeze to death before morning. So they buried the house. They cut massive blocks of sod, grass, heavy soil, and root systems, and stacked them against the exterior walls. These layers of turf could be up to 6 feet thick at the base. They essentially built an artificial hill around their home. This turf layer acted as a thermal mass. In the summer, it kept the interior cool, but in the winter, it worked like a heavy blanket. It trapped the heat generated inside so effectively that even when the air outside was cold enough to kill livestock, the interior of the longhouse could maintain a steady, survivable temperature. However, this insulation created a secondary problem: dampness. A house wrapped in wet earth is naturally humid. To keep the roof from rotting, they laid down sheets of birch bark, which is naturally waterproof, before weighing it down with more sod. The result was a home that felt heavy, earthy, and enclosed. But a warm house is useless if you can't generate heat. Firewood was a precious resource. Gathering it required trudging through waist-deep snow, and chopping it burned calories that were hard to replace when food was rationed. You simply couldn't afford to burn a massive bonfire 24 hours a day all winter long. They needed a heat source that ran constantly without burning wood. Their solution was the livestock. A typical longhouse was roughly 80 to 100 feet long, divided strictly into 2 sections. One end, the scaly, was for the humans. The other end, the fjós, or byre, was for the animals. In the autumn, as the frost set in, the family would bring their most valuable animals inside. The dairy cows, the sheep, and the goats would spend the entire winter standing in stalls just a few yards away from where the family slept. It sounds unsanitary to modern ears, but it was a brilliant manipulation of physics. A 1,000-pound dairy cow radiates a massive amount of body heat. A flock of sheep with their thick wool acts like a living radiator. By packing these animals into the enclosed space of the longhouse, the family created a biological heating system that ran entirely on hay. The body heat from the animals would rise and circulate through the house, raising the ambient temperature by several crucial degrees. However, keeping these animals alive was its own logistical nightmare. Grass doesn't grow in winter. In the autumn, the Vikings had to harvest immense amounts of hay, but they also used leaf fodder. During the summer, they would cut branches from birch and ash trees, dry them, and stack them. In the dead of winter, when the hay ran low, they would feed the dried leaves and even the bark to the animals to keep them from starving. It was a constant calorie calculation. If you miscalculated the amount of fodder in October, your heater would die in January. This is why the month of October was known as Gormanath, or Slaughter Month. Before the snows came, the farmers had to make a cold-blooded decision about which animals were worth keeping through the winter and which ones were just mouths to feed. The weaker animals were slaughtered, their meat preserved for the humans, because keeping them alive would risk the food supply for the strong ones. The presence of the animals inside the house created the most defining feature of winter life: the smell. The floor of the animal section was usually dug lower than the living area, often paved with stones or stamped earth, with trenches to carry waste away. But in the deep freeze of January, drainage systems fail. The exit holes in the walls would freeze shut. The slurry of manure and urine would often pile up, unable to be moved until a thaw. The families lived in a constant, thick atmosphere of smoke, unwashed bodies, animal sweat, and ammonia. The ammonia rising from the decomposing waste was potent. While it was unpleasant, historians believe it served an accidental medical purpose. Ammonia is a chemical irritant to insects. The fumes in the longhouse were likely strong enough to suppress the populations of lice, fleas, and ticks that plagued ancient people. In a crowded environment where typhus could wipe out a household in weeks, the terrible smell might have been the thing that kept them healthy. Despite the filth, the Vikings were culturally obsessed with grooming. It seems contradictory, but in a crowded house, hygiene is a survival protocol. If one person gets a skin infection, everyone gets it. We find combs made of bone and antler in Viking graves more frequently than we find weapons. They combed their hair daily to remove dirt and parasites. Since washing with water was dangerous, getting wet in a drafty house could lead to hyperthermia. They likely used steam baths if they had a separate sauna structure, or they used snow to scrub the skin. For toileting, they didn't have the luxury of imported fabrics. They used nature's sponge, sphagnum moss. This moss grows abundantly in the Scandinavian bogs. It is soft, highly absorbent, and has mild antiseptic properties due to its acidity. In the autumn, families would gather massive sacks of this moss and stack it in the rafters, drying it out to be used throughout the winter. Once the issues of heat and hygiene were managed, the family faced the most relentless threat: starvation. From late October to April, the Scandinavian landscape is frozen iron. Nothing grows. You cannot dig for roots, hunting is difficult and burns more energy than it often provides. Survival depended entirely on the food preservation engineering done months prior. They relied on two primary technologies: dehydration and acidification. The most important calorie source was stockfish. In the spring, the Vikings caught massive amounts of cod. Salt was a luxury import and too expensive to use for bulk preservation, so they used the wind. They gutted the fish and hung them on massive wooden racks called hjell. The cold, dry air of the north removed all moisture from the fish before it could rot. The result was a fish that was as hard as a plank of wood. It was virtually indestructible. You could stack it like firewood in the corner of the longhouse and it would remain edible for years. Eating it, however, was manual labor. The fish was too hard to bite. To prepare dinner, someone had to take the fish to the anvil or a flat stone and smash it repeatedly with a hammer to break the protein fibers. It was then soaked and boiled. It was chewy and bland, but it was pure protein. For meat, they turned to sour whey. The Vikings consumed a lot of dairy, specifically skyr, a type of soft cheese. A byproduct of making skyr is whey, a watery liquid. If you let whey sit, it ferments and turns into lactic acid. The Vikings discovered that this acid was a powerful preservative. They would take cooked meat, lamb, beef, or horse, pack it into barrels, and pour the sour whey over it until it was submerged. The acid prevented bacteria from growing. They could pull a piece of meat out of that barrel 4 months later and it would be safe to eat. The meat would take on a tart, sour flavor, but it provided the essential fats needed to keep their bodies warm. They also ate porridge, or grout, made from barley or oats, but grinding the grain was a daily, back-breaking chore. The hand mill, or quernstone, had to be turned for hours to produce enough flour for 30 people. This task usually fell to the women or the thralls, slaves, a rhythmic grinding noise that would have been the background soundtrack to the winter. The air quality inside the house was a separate danger. To conserve heat, the longhouse was sealed as tight as possible. There were no windows. The only light came from the central hearth fire. While the roof had a vent, a gap in the shingles, or a specialized wooden chimney to let smoke escape, it relied on the draft. In heavy weather, or if the wind blew from the wrong direction, the smoke would be pushed back down into the house. This created a smoke ceiling. The upper half of the room would fill with a dense, stinging smog. This dictated the posture of daily life. You didn't stand up tall in a longhouse during winter. You moved in a crouch. The benches where people sat and slept were low to the ground, keeping everyone in the layer of clearer air near the floor. Even with these precautions, the health toll was severe. Osteologists examining Viking skeletons frequently find carbon deposits fused into the inside of the ribs and chronic infection damage in the sinus cavities. They were breathing the equivalent of several packs of cigarettes a day, simply by trying to stay warm. The fire also brought the risk of carbon monoxide poisoning. If the fire smoldered rather than burned, the colorless, odorless gas could pool in the unventilated room. It was a silent killer. The families likely relied on the behavior of the smaller animals to warn them. Chickens, often kept in the rafters or near the byre, have smaller lungs and higher metabolisms. If the chickens stopped moving or fell from their perches, the family knew they had to throw open the heavy door and let the freezing air in immediately, or they would never wake up. By February, the physical systems of survival were usually holding steady. The routine was established. But this is when the psychological battle began. The Vikings called the winter depression skamdagisthunglindi, or short-day depression. Being trapped in a confined space with extended family, crying children, and animals for 18 hours of darkness a day creates immense social friction. Privacy did not exist. The high seat belonging to the head of the household was the only designated place of authority. Everyone else slept on raised earthen benches lining the walls, shoulder to shoulder, covered in furs. To prevent social breakdown, they structured their time rigidly. Idleness was considered dangerous. If people sat around doing nothing, they would brood, arguments would start, and violence could erupt. So industry was mandatory. The most crucial winter industry was textile production. We often think of Viking power coming from their axes, but it really came from their sails. A Viking longship required a massive square sail made of wool. To create a single sail took longer than building the ship itself. It required millions of meters of thread. This work fell to the women. They used a warp-weighted loom, a large upright frame where the threads were held taut by clay weights. The rhythmic thump-thump click of the loom was the heartbeat of the winter house. The women spun thread from the wool sheared off the sheep in the autumn, working by the dim light of the fire or oil lamps filled with seal fat or fish oil. This wasn't just busy work, it was the economic engine of the Viking Age. The raids and trading voyages of the summer were entirely dependent on the production capacity of the winter. To occupy the mind, they played games. Hneftafl, a strategic board game similar to chess but with a king surrounded by attackers, was played obsessively. It was a war simulator that kept the men's minds sharp, but the most powerful tool against the darkness was the voice. The Viking culture was oral. They didn't read books in the longhouse, they performed them. The saga telling was a nightly ritual. These weren't just bedtime stories, they were complex, multi-hour histories of ancestors, gods, and legal disputes. A good storyteller was a high-status individual because they held the power to transport the room out of the smoky, smelly confinement and into a world of glory. They recited poetry in strict meter, a mental exercise that required immense memory and focus, acting as a cognitive barrier against the creeping lethargy of the dark. They also broke the monotony with festivals. The celebration of Yule in midwinter was a crucial psychological release valve. It was a time to slaughter a specialized animal, drink the ale that had been fermenting since the harvest, and feast. The ale was vital. It was calorie-dense and sterile, safer to drink than stored water. The drunkenness and the feasting served to bond the group together and prove that they still had resources to spare, that the winter hadn't beaten them yet. By February, the physical systems of survival were usually holding steady. The routine was established, but this is when the psychological battle began. The people who emerged from the longhouses in April were pale from months of sun deprivation. Their clothes were saturated with the smell of smoke and soot, their eyes were red, and they were likely thinner, having rationed their dried fish and sour meat as the stores dwindled. But they were alive. We tend to romanticize the Vikings as explorers and warriors, focusing on the weeks they spent raiding the coasts of England or trading in Constantinople. But those summer exploits were the easy part. The true test of the Viking character was the ability to endure the domestic siege of the north. They took a landscape that was actively hostile to human life and engineered a way to exist within it. They turned their architecture into aerodynamics. They turned their livestock into living heaters. They turned their food chemistry into time capsules. And they turned their social structure into a mechanism for sanity. The reality of the Viking Age wasn't glorious battles under a summer sun. It was the grit of holding a family together in the dark, breathing smoke and ammonia, waiting for the earth to turn back toward the light. It wasn't magic and it wasn't luck. It was a brutal, calculated engineering of survival.